Welcome to episode 68 of the Headspace and Timing Podcast, a show brought to you by the Change Your POV Podcast Network. Today, I have a conversation with Dr. Carl Castro, the Director for the Center of Innovation and Research on Veterans and Military Families at the USC Dworak-Peck School of Social Work. Here's a quick preview of what you'll hear in this episode, then we'll hear a quick word from my buddy Bennett Tanton about one of the network sponsors, then we'll get into the show.
That's where we still struggle, after all of these years of being at war and all the deployments that our military has participated in. We still really struggle with welcoming them back into the community and supporting them with the type of support they need.
Today's sponsor is USA Military Medals. USA Military Medals is the leader in high-quality military medals and ribbons made in the USA. More than 30,000 United States Armed Forces uniform items in stock, same day and next day shipping. They are the Easy Rack Builder guys. The Easy Rack Builder on their site is amazing, as is the Shadow Box Builder. They can do everything from a flag and memorabilia display to a single metal display. I've had a shadow box made as a retirement gift and it came out amazing. If you're looking to build your legacy and hand something down to your children or family, there's nothing better than a professionally made shadow box. So to recap, get your official U.S. military medals, ribbons, badges, patches, dog tags, and shadow boxes. They even have uniforms, tactical gear, gifts, and much, much more. So go to USA Military Medals and check them out by going to changeyourpov.com/resources.
Welcome to the Change Your POV Podcast Network. You're listening to Headspace and Timing, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes about veteran mental health. My name's Dwayne France, and I'm a combat veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan. After I retired from the Army, I took on a new mission as a clinical mental health counselor for my fellow service members. If you served in any branch of the military, you're familiar with the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal. It's one of the most effective weapons in the military's arsenal. If the weapon's headspace and timing wasn't set right, however, it was just a huge useless chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing isn't set correctly either. That's my goal with this show, to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week, we'll talk with mental health professionals, veterans, and those who support veterans, service members, and their families. We're going to have real and honest conversations about a topic that most just don't like to talk about, veteran mental health. Let's jump into this week's conversation. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Headspace and Timing Podcast. Once again, and as always, we really appreciate you taking the time to listen and to learn more about veteran mental health. As you know on the show, we're trying to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health. And we do that in a variety of ways, some of which we talk about veterans who have their own mental health journey, and then also mental health professionals who are talking about the research and the services. And today, once again, we have somebody who's actually doing both. So our guest today is Carl Castro, and we'll go ahead and get into a conversation with him. Carl, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, certainly. As you and I briefly talked, and even the correspondence, our colleague, Anthony Hassan, you and he had done some work together before, but definitely speaks highly of you and your work and what you've done as far as the research and the understanding to move these things forward. But before we get into some of that, I guess I'd like to have you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and maybe from your military and then what you're doing now.
Okay, great. I always like to start off by letting folks know that I am a military veteran. I retired 5 years ago, almost to today. After serving 33 years in the military, I started off my career as a private 11 Bravo infantry and went on to become an officer, and I retired a colonel in the U.S. Army. And my last set of assignments really involved assessing the psychological and physical health of soldiers and Marines as they deployed into and out of combat. And I'm now a professor at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles.
So, in that, of course, it's always interesting how we can sum up, over a quarter century of our life in about 30 seconds. But what transitioned you from, obviously, your military service into veteran mental health?
Well, so, I've always been interested, obviously, in what we can do as a military to preserve and enhance and sustain the health and well-being of our active duty forces. And so my focus has really been almost exclusively on active duty components, primarily around deployments, peacekeeping missions, shipborne deployments, combat deployments. But we were always interested in sort of the life cycle approach, because it's not as if, well, what happens to you on active duty, we no longer care once you leave the military. So although I wasn't personally involved in doing veteran-related research, I was responsible for overseeing the funding of a lot of our veteran health-related research. And so once I became a veteran myself, then it afforded me that opportunity to really begin continuing sort of that story of what happens on active duty has just tremendous impact of what happens to you when you're a veteran, and in particular in that transition process. So it was just kind of a natural progression of my own research interest.
No, you're absolutely right. And that focus on, obviously, warfighter or active duty service member is very important. I talk about that's when we were in the machine. And then once we're out of the machine, we see things in a totally different way. And we do see, I think when we're out of the military, we see the long-term impacts much greater than we did see when we were in the military. You probably did anticipate what things would happen in the life cycle, but things were much more immediate, I think, when we were on active duty.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when you are, in combat, you're not thinking about what you're going to do 10 years from that point. You're thinking about survival. Mm-hmm. And then you're thinking about quickly recovering, if you survive that incident, to go out and do it again the next day and the next day and the next day and the next day until you get home. So, our time horizon becomes very, very, very short and very, very near to us. And of course, then once you're thinking of leaving the military, you're either going to just separate because your contract is over or you're retiring. Then you start having, well, what am I going to do when I leave? So then the horizon becomes a little bit longer.
Sure, but I think, and definitely even in my experience, and I was about like you, I retired in about 4 years ago, that we really didn't know what was there beyond that. I mean, as I talk about trying to pierce the veil of fog after leaving the military, a lot of, we hear about it, but we don't really understand. We don't know what it's going to be. And so even though we know that there's life after the military, it's really theoretical until it's almost upon us.
That's a great point. And a lot of service members, a lot of soldiers that I talk to, they think leaving the military is actually going to improve their life. And for some it does. Mm-hmm. But for many, it's a real struggle transitioning from an active duty back to civilian life, because they really have forgotten what it's like to be a civilian, because the military does such an effective job of indoctrinating and acculturating somebody into the military. I mean, just think back when you went to basic training and what the stories that people tell, they could tell them 50 years from now in detail because they were so vivid and imprinted on them in such a powerful way. And they almost forget what it's like to be a civilian. And they think it's going to be easier than what it turns out to be for a lot of folks.
Yeah, I can see that. And even if somebody, like you said, they spent 6 years in or they spent 26 years in, they say, yeah, basic was tough, but looking back on it, it wasn't that tough and I adjusted there. And even if they don't think that consciously, they think they may be able to make that same adjustment back. But it's very different because there is no basic training for civilian life.
Well, and you don't have that support. I mean,
Right.
let's be honest. Basic training has a lot of support, right? I mean, we have lots of drill instructors, barracks facilities, training facilities. There's a lot of support to welcome someone into the military, but there's very, very little support, organized support, probably said differently, to help a veteran transition back to civilian life. I mean, there's lots of support out there, but as you correctly described, I mean, it's all over the place. It's not really clear. It is like a fog because none of it's coordinated, none of it's working together. It's just individual entities. I help veterans with jobs. I help veterans with housing. I help veterans with health. And so it's all over the place. There's not one place you go to that helps you in that process.
Yeah, I have seen that definitely with the veterans that I work with, that they have to find and build their own individual support structure, whereas in the military, it's given to us in a package, everything, even to our social networks and our community is handed to us and told what we do. But then when we leave the military, we have to piece that together ourselves. And maybe some veterans are better at doing that than others. And that support network, like you said, is critical, but it's not very easily assembled.
Exactly. Absolutely correct. And, and that's where we still struggle, after all of these years of, being at war and all the deployments that our military has participated in, we still really struggle with welcoming them back into the community and supporting them, with the type of support they need.
Right. And I think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that comes from an understanding on the veterans' part, that there does need to be that adaptation, but then the understanding on the part of the community that the veteran returns to, about even what veterans are about. I was seeing in one of your articles, and we often do discuss or talk about the veteran divide, right? Military-civilian divide. But the support that is necessary by those providing the support, it's often a lack of understanding.
Oh yeah, and what goes with understanding is expectancy. Like what to expect, and oftentimes, service members leaving the military, they don't know what to expect. Civilians who are going to be interacting with veterans don't know what to expect. And civilians rely a lot on media reports, and the media reports are very skewed, either to every veteran's a hero, to every veteran is suicidal, homicidal, and all screwed up. But most veterans are in the middle, and we don't really have a dialogue of like, well, what does the typical veteran look like, and what are their needs, and then also just building the expectation from the service member who's leaving the military perspective, what to expect. And you often don't, we often say, nobody knows. The civilians are disconnected with the military because, vast majority of civilians don't serve in the military, never will serve in the military, have very little action with, activity or interaction with people who serve in the military. And so they don't really know what to expect either. And then, so there's this lack of communication between, even a common language. So if a veteran did start talking about their service, most civilians wouldn't even understand most of what they were saying because of just the language difference.
Yes, I've recognized that too. And again, even that discomfort, this disjointedness that a lot of veterans experience. And you reference sort of the media, right? The portrayal of veterans in the media, not just films and things like that, but definitely in the news. But there's a point of when somebody may watch, American Sniper or Black Hawk Down, and they may watch it in the movie theater, and it's entertainment to them. But then if I were to go to my local barbecue and talk about those same stories and I'm here in front of you, that would be a very different reaction. And so there's a difference between seeing veterans and understanding or appreciating veterans at a distance to appreciating the veteran that's sitting right next to you or working in the cubicle next to you or sitting across the interview table.
Oh, that's a great point. One of the things that our research shows is that most civilians, they love the idea of a veteran and they love supporting the idea of veterans. But when it comes to their own personal behavior, of hiring a veteran, reaching out to a veteran, then you get this sort of disconnect between the idea and then the actual behavior they engage in. And I think a lot of it comes through this lack of understanding and in some sense fear, because most civilians don't really know how to interact with veterans. And so again, it's helping them understand, sort of this experience that our veterans have, but more importantly, the contributions they can still make to society and the contributions they can make towards a job if they're hired, and the contributions they can make to a community that they're a member of. That's, to me, the most important thing to communicate.
No, I absolutely agree with that, and there seems to be a widening in the gap, not just between the civilians and the military, but those veterans that are able to, quote unquote, make a successful transition, whatever that looks like, but those that are able to successfully reintegrate and have a stable post-military life, let's call it, and then those that can't, right? That those two groups seem to be separating within the veteran community. Do you see that?
Yeah, and it's really important, Dwayne, to really appreciate that most veterans transition fine.
Mm-hmm.
There'll be a little bump here and there, a little bump here and there, but most veterans do transition okay. The vast majority transition okay, but there is that significant number of veterans who do struggle in that transition process, and that could be, anywhere, depending on what numbers you want to look at and what outcomes you want to look at. It varies between, 8, 9, 10%, some numbers as high as 20%. Now, that doesn't mean that veterans, that the 80% don't have any needs, but I'm just talking about the transition itself. They transition fine. A lot of veterans do have unmet needs, healthcare needs, primarily physical health care, some mental health care needs as well. They have difficulty finding that right job for them. They can get a job, but it's not the right job. It's not the job they really derive meaning from, because keep in mind, they're coming from an organization where, meaning was like preeminent in military service, right? You're defending your country, you're defending your buddies beside you. Talk about a job that has meaning. And it's hard to match that in a civilian job, to match, that aspect of it. And so veterans do bounce around, when they get out. First few years, they bounce around from job to job, trying to figure out, okay, what's good for me, what works best for me. But eventually they figure that out, and then they, jump right in and contribute to their community and society.
That meaning piece is very significant, and I know that I've mentioned it on the show before for some longtime listeners, but the clinical work that I do with veterans, about how many you would expect, around maybe 15, 20% of the veterans are dealing with some form of post-traumatic stress disorder, but full diagnosable post-traumatic stress disorder. But 100%, just about every single veteran that I work with, struggle with finding purpose and meaning in their post-military life. And that's not PTSD, right? That's not post-traumatic stress disorder. That's not traumatic brain injury. And sometimes some of our interventions when it comes to veteran mental health are focused on PTSD, but purpose and meaning is existential psychology with, Yalom and Frankl and things like that.
Well, absolutely right. And not being able to derive meaning is not, a clinical disorder, right? People who've never served in the military struggle to define meaning in their lives, right? And so, but in the military, when you enlist at 17, 18, 19 years old, the military is all you really known as an adult, even if you've only served 6 or 7 years, and never mind if you served a career. And and trying to recapture that meaning sometimes is not possible. There's just not enough jobs that will give you that kind of meaning, paying jobs. And therefore, that's when oftentimes people will say, well, volunteer, join an organization, be a Boy Scout leader or a member of your church where you're leading a group where you can also derive meaning. So you can derive meaning in your life in a variety of ways. It doesn't all have to be employment related. It can be through volunteer work. It could be through a hobby that you enjoy doing. So you can do it through a variety of mechanisms to derive meaning. I don't think we've fully explored with many of our veterans, how they can derive meaning in all of these other venues. That doesn't have to be a paid job that you're getting your meaning and your purpose in life.
No, I absolutely do think that that is emerging, and I think that especially veterans who are noticing that gap, let's say, in the whether they call them new age veteran organizations, but things like Team Rubicon and Team Red, White, and Blue and the Travis Manion Foundation, but these organizations that, take a veteran's desire to serve again and utilizes that for community good. And so I absolutely do agree that that there are different ways. That's what I talk about to my veterans, say, okay, and it's not the whole flipping burgers thing, but, hey, you got a good job on an assembly line, or you got a good job working in a hospital, but it's not satisfying you, but you don't have to keep finding the job that satisfies you. Find something else in your life to satisfy. And so you have the purpose, the action that I must, pay my bills, and find meaning in other ways. So it's great to hear that. And a lot of that has to come down to the veteran, I think, understanding themselves. And if we're talking about this concept of understanding, a lot of times veterans themselves don't have an awareness of how their service, not combat specifically, but definitely that, but just their service in general, they don't have an awareness about how it changed them.
No, they absolutely don't. And it's that lack of awareness that can really cause them to struggle the first couple of years when they leave the military. Because, people change gradually over time, so they're not aware of 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years of change that's happened to them, because it's happened gradually. Even when our service members deploy to combat environments, a year's a long time, but they're not aware of how over the year they've really changed, and combat really magnifies those changes. So when they come home from combat or when they leave the military, people go, wow, this person's really different. For themselves, they don't feel like they've changed that much because the change has been gradual. But for those who have been around them, who know them very well, like parents, close friends, spouses, they go, wow, you've really changed. And they go, what do you mean I've changed? I'm the same person I've always been. But they're not the same person they've always been. They're different. In many ways, profoundly different. And not in a bad way. And not in a bad way. They're just different. And now oftentimes people will take the different as being negative, and they shouldn't. You're just different.
Right. Different doesn't mean bad, and different is the reality. I mean, it's what it is. I recall my wife saying the same thing. I walked back, and specifically, I think after my Afghanistan deployment. So this was a 15-month tour in Iraq, and then another 12-month tour in Afghanistan over a 3-year period. And she said, I saw you, my husband, but then you weren't you. And she was like, she could tell. And of course, her mother and my parents had mentioned it too, that there is a change, but it's sort of like, if somebody loses weight gradually, but you don't see them for 6 months, and all of a sudden you see somebody who's, 30 pounds lighter or whatever, it's a striking change for somebody who hasn't seen the gradualness of it. But for the person that's losing weight, it does become that gradual sense.
That's right. That's a really good analogy, actually, to describe how things can change gradually, but the end state can be profoundly different than the starting point.
And so a lot of this awareness, and you and Sarah Kinsel and Anthony Hassan had wrote an article, and this was something that I had not latched onto, but I developed an infographic that demonstrated this because it spoke to me so profoundly, both as a clinical mental health professional and as a veteran, about the combat veteran paradox and the number of paradoxes that combat veterans specifically deal with when they return from combat or they leave the military. So could you talk a bit about the paradox and maybe go through a couple with us?
Oh, sure. So, what we had seen, in the literature and in the clinic is that you often see what appears to be contradictory statements that veterans would make about themselves and about other veterans. And, so we said, these are really what we mean by paradoxes. And just, for the listeners, a paradox is a statement that seems to contradict itself, but might be true. And the example that I like to give that everybody really resonates with is if you're married or you have a spouse who spends money. Well, my wife will often say things like, I saved you money by buying this on sale. And it's, wait a minute, how did you save me money by spending my money? And because that seems like a contradiction. Well, I explained to people, well, if we actually needed that item and my wife got it on sale, then she actually saved me money. But if she bought an item that we didn't need, then she actually didn't save me any money, even though she may have gotten it on sale. So you need to really kind of look deeper into that statement. And what we found is that combat veterans in particular, but as you noted, anyone who served in the military may experience many of these similar paradoxes. And so some of them is, things like what we call the safety paradox. Veterans will tell you, combat veterans in particular will tell you, hey, I survived combat, I proved myself, I'm not afraid of dying, nothing can harm me, et cetera, et cetera. But then at the same time, they have this kind of worldview that the world's unsafe, they can't trust anyone, they want to go around armed all the time, carrying a weapon. And you think, well, if the world is safe and nothing can harm you because you survived combat, why do you feel the need to be armed? So it presents somewhat of a paradox for them. And one of the ones that spouses really understand is this silence paradox. And that is that, combat veterans believe no one can possibly understand what it's like, to be in combat. But then at the same time, they say, I don't want to talk about my combat experiences. But if no one can understand it, how are they going to understand it unless you talk about it, right? So it's this kind of catch-22 in some sense as well, that in order to understand what a combat veteran went through, they have to talk about their experiences in some detail, not in all the gory details, but at some level to explain why they may be perceived as a different person that we were talking about earlier that spouses are very quick to pick up on. Well, why are you different? Well, one, I don't think I'm different, but if you do think I'm different, maybe these experiences that I had can help explain that. And of course, they can be very, very illuminating for friends and loved ones to have some sense of what was experienced. Again, not in all the details necessarily, but just in general, what it was like to be constantly concerned about one's personal safety for prolonged periods of time. And there are other paradoxes that we talk about as well. And I don't know if there's any particular ones, Wayne, that you want to explore in more detail. But those are what we wanted, combat veterans to understand, one, about themselves, but we also wanted civilians to be aware of them as well, so they could understand and explore more deeply these paradoxes that combat veterans may be experiencing.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up the silence paradox because independently through my experience in working with veterans, I had written a blog post that talked about the paradox of the veteran story. that we want everybody to know what we did while not having to tell them what we did. Right. And so we want everybody to know our story. And that's actually the one that Anthony reached out and said, hey, take a look at this. And he has sent me your article. And that's exactly it. I sort of explain when I came back from Afghanistan, and I was a platoon sergeant for a security platoon and escorted supplies and things like that. But we were gun trucks. And I remember coming back from Afghanistan and going to Knoxville, Tennessee, where my wife is from, and my brother-in-law and I were building a deck for her parents. And I was a week removed from Afghanistan, and I was still thinking about what was going on over there, and all in my head, and I was screaming and yelling in my brain, saying, don't you guys know there's a war going on, where it's just a nice July day, in Knoxville, Tennessee. And so after 3 or 4 days, and nobody wanted to talk to me about it, but then when my brother-in-law, at the end of the day, and the sun's going down, and we sat back and finished the work, and he was, at that point, he said, and it was, not to make it sound dramatic, but he was like really quiet, and he was like, so what was it like over there? And at that precise moment, I didn't want to tell him. I had wanted to tell him the entire 3 or 4 days, but then at that moment, I was like, rough, right? And it was... And so that's definitely something that I personally experienced, but veterans aren't aware of that until we put a name on it. Yeah, and it's you also mentioned another paradox, which is the back there paradox. Right.
Where when you're deployed, all you want to do is be home. You miss your family. If you've been deployed multiple times, you see no point in it. Nothing's really changing. And then when you're home, all you want to do is return on deployment, be back there with the guys, etc. So you can have multiple paradoxes going on simultaneously. And the one about telling your story is so important. And I always tell folks, look, you need to have two stories. You need to have the long version of your story that you really want to share with someone, and then you need to have a shorter version of the story that you can also share to people. Maybe it's not the right time to share, or they're a complete stranger and they ask you, and you just have kind of a nice, polite, short story you give them. And then you can have a longer one where you can go into more detail. But telling your story is really important. But it's also important, as you really hit on, is telling your story the way you want to tell it, when you want to tell it. You're on nobody's timeline to tell your story when they want to hear it. And it can be off-putting based on when they ask you for your story, right? So, you've experienced multiple paradoxes, like in a very short period of time simultaneously, or one right after the other.
And I like that, definitely the idea of having two versions of your story. And I hadn't even considered that, but I think that's very true. I've got a colleague, Richard Casper. He runs the Veteran Artist Project, and he, in a conversation, he and I talked about this, where he helps veterans produce art, obviously reflecting some of the things inside of them in different mediums. But he said that in the beginning, they'll be presenting a piece, and the veteran will be standing there next to their piece, and somebody who hadn't served will come up and ask about it or talk about it, and the veteran is able to, say, this is what happened. It's something very surface, like you said, very innocuous and not in depth. But another veteran who comes up, and they know that individual's a veteran, they get a totally different story. And the story is the real story that's underneath the surface. But Richard said eventually it gets to the point where the veteran can then give a little bit of the deep story to those individuals who hadn't served. And so it becomes a progression, and the telling becomes easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we all know that. It's called training, right? With training, you get better. And the more times you tell your story, the better you'll get at telling it. And the more people you're likely to tell it, you're able to tailor it to certain individuals and to certain contexts as well. So this is why it's just, you can rehearse it mentally first by yourself, and you can rehearse it out loud by yourself. there's you mentioned the arts. There's a bit of acting and storytelling too, right? And so this is why I think acting classes are so attractive to a lot of veterans, because it allows them kind of not be who they are, but who they are, because they're, quote, acting. And I think that's also very, very helpful in the healing process and in the understanding process.
And that does taking that step to get into that, and maybe through art, maybe through theater, maybe through writing, right? Obviously poetry or what have you, or even just long form writing. It's a safe way, but a distant way. There's sort of a buffer in between, me telling my story and somebody going and reading my story. But it takes a lot to get over that first initial hesitation. And one of the ones that I often discuss with my veterans is the courage paradox, the one that the combat veterans are strong and courageous, yet they're afraid of being weak and damaged. So on one side, I prove my strength and courage in combat, but then on the other side, I think that talking about these things or showing emotion will reduce that strength. And so that's significant for a lot of veterans, that maybe that's a paradox that keeps them from moving forward.
Oh, absolutely. And, and that's just part of our culture in society, but it's also really a very strong part of the military culture. And that is, not to show weaknesses, right? And because showing weaknesses is a vulnerability that your enemies can exploit. And so we try not to show weaknesses. And, I've heard, combat veterans tell me, well, I can never apologize because, that would be showing a sign of weakness, like I had made a mistake. And I said, well, and most, combat veterans are men, but there are some women. And I would ask them, and both men and women answer this the same way. I said, how many of you have ever apologized to your spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend for something that you are completely innocent on, but you said you apologized anyway? Every single hand goes up in the room, right? And I said, well, and why did you do that? Why did you apologize? And they come up with basically three reasons. The first reason is, well, to get her to shut up. All right, you hear that one. Other ones to say, to keep the peace. And then the most popular one, I will say, is to have sex, right? Because if apology is all you need to have sex, I am sorry, baby. And so people apologize for lots of reasons when they actually know they're completely innocent. And that's not a sign of weakness, right? It's a sign of building strong relationships. And so you have to kind of reframe it. You can say you're sorry. You can show emotions. You can admit weaknesses. That's how you build relationships, because then people feel needed in a relationship if another person has a weakness that they can kind of be a backstop for. It's what makes teams stronger, right? I mean, you're only as strong as your weakest link, right? That's one of kind of like the sayings in the military. But it doesn't matter if you have a weakness, because somebody else will have a strength that can backstop you, right? Double check you, right? We check each other. That's the whole buddy system, right? And so it's just kind of acknowledging that. And I think that helps people, certainly helps our veterans and our combat veterans in particular, understand that admitting you made a mistake, even apologizing when you don't have anything to apologize for, it's not a sign of weakness. It's really a sign of building strong relationships.
Sure, and then that touches on another one of the paradoxes that was in your article, the intimacy paradox, where we can form bonds that last, a lifetime with people that we were deployed with. Literally yesterday, as we're recording this, one of my soldiers that deployed with me in Afghanistan was on his way through Colorado Springs, says, hey, let's meet up for coffee. Hadn't seen him in 9 years. And yet, he called, I went, and that's sort of the way that goes. So we have those intimate bonds with the people that we served with, but we struggle to create or recreate or reestablish intimate relationships when we return.
Yeah, absolutely true. You see that all the time. And And even sometimes, spouses will complain, about, he's been gone for a year and all he wants to do is hang around with his buddies. And he says he misses his family, but he never wants to do anything with the family. And it's not so much that as it's so much you have this shared experience that you don't really have to talk about if you don't want to. You can just mention kind of in periphery certain things and you have that shared experience. So you know exactly what happened. You don't have to go through all the details. And it also gets to this part about not really having to tell your whole story to someone who experienced it because you were there, right? If you and I experienced the same comment, I don't have to give you all the details. You know what happened. You were there. But we can talk about what we thought about it, how it affected us without going into all the details about the event itself. And that's very, very protecting. And it's trying to get, sometimes spouses to understand that, that it's hard to loop somebody in on a shared experience that they weren't part of. They're always going to be an outsider. But then there are also, veterans are afraid of losing someone they care about. Whereas your buddy and you've made it. You survived the combat experience. You guys now have each other for the rest of your lives. But you're not sure about new people, right? If I have a strong relationship with this person and then they leave or something happens to me, then I've kind of lost that relationship. And there is this fear of loss that kind of is the undercurrent sometimes about these intimacy issues that a lot of our veterans have.
And then that goes back to our earlier conversation about how do we build a support network to augment that. We do still have that support network, but we're scattered across the United States and sometimes across the globe. But in order to reestablish a support network, that fire team or whatever you want to call it after the military, you do have to get over the intimacy paradox and take that chance. But then it goes back to that idea, if I'm sitting here in a barbecue and I'm telling my lone survivor story or whatever, I don't want to see the horror in someone's eyes, or I don't want to see the pity in someone's eyes, or I don't want to see whatever emotion that's there, because then that confirms what I believe to be about myself. I'm monstrous, or I'm something, to be pitied. Or like you said, that person's going to say, oh, well, that's nice, and then go walk and talk to somebody else. And that's going to confirm that idea of I'm alone, I'm alone, I'm alone.
Yeah, and you hit on two things that are really important. And one is this judging. Combat veterans are very, 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 very sensitive to being judged about what they did, what they experienced, how their experience affected them. And so that's a real issue, kind of taking a risk of being judged when you tell your story, right? And then the second thing is being, kind of ignored or dismissed, having your experience, minimized. And so those are two real kind of important emotions that the veterans just have to be aware of that can happen. And what are you going to do if somebody starts judging you what you did or didn't do, or being dismissive of your experiences is not relevant or uninteresting, right? Both of those are equally annoying and can really inflame some veterans. So, those are real issues that just need to be thought about. And, okay, what are you going to do if this happens? What are you going to do if that happens? And get them to, act in an appropriate way. But those are really serious emotions that one always must be mindful of when you tell your story, that those are two possible outcomes that you may not think you're going to get, but you could get.
And that's one of the things is, a lot of veterans say, okay, now that I know, how do I get there, right? And maybe definitely not so much in the direct work that I do, but when somebody, reads something that I wrote or something like that, they'll reach out and say, okay, now I know, then what? And this was something that out of that article that identified it's mental health counseling. It's not going on the couch, and this is the stigma against what we do as our profession. But in that article, you said that counseling should focus on helping the combat veteran understand how experiences might influence their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, and it can help combat veterans understand the paradoxes often experienced. And so all of these things you talk about, how do I, how do we do this? How do we tell our story safely? How do we develop the story, the surface story and the deep story? How do we practice these intimacies? In the mental health counseling session, it should be a very safe place for a veteran to maybe manage these paradoxes.
Well, yeah, and it could be through a counseling session. It could be talking to a trusted mentor, an advisor. It could even be talking to your spouse. You could say, "Hey, what is this? How would this sound?" And spouse will give you some candid, honest feedback, right? And so there are lots of ways to start the journey. The critical thing is you're not going to get there overnight. It's a process. It takes time. Sometimes it takes years, maybe more years than we'd like to admit. And eventually you'll become comfortable with who you are and how you tell your story. And, so a lot of it is just being patient. I always tell combat veterans, the thing that if you could do anything is just take everything you do slowly. Everything you do slowly. Form relationships slowly. Drink slowly when you start drinking again. Do everything in very, very slowly in moderations. And don't try to make up for lost time. That's kind of one of the downfalls. Or like when you leave the military, I'm out of the military now I'm free. Don't still go slow. Take the process slowly. And when you go slow, you're less likely to make mistakes. You're also less likely to make big mistakes, and you're less likely to scare people, by telling your whole story all at once, right? Go slow, tell pieces at a time, tell stories shorter. You can make them longer as you go and add to it. But I say go slow and don't expect to get there overnight.
No, I really appreciate that. I say sort of the same thing to veterans that I work with in that, okay, now that you're used to talking about it, be very careful about how you do it outside of this, because I liken it to, you can be like a St. Bernard, right? Saying hello. And then it's just this overwhelming to people because once, and this is the other thing when that paradox of the veteran story, once we do start to tell our story, and we have the feeling of satisfaction, we want to tell it over, and we want a lot of people to know. And so I really appreciate that. Although, patience for men and women of action, men and women who are, used to getting the job done and going 90 miles an hour, even learning to go slow can be difficult.
Oh, yeah. You've got to unlearn a whole set of behaviors that are highly reinforced in the military, which is now, solve it now, get it done, get it now, right? And, but even if you just back off take an extra 5 or 6 seconds, can be very, very, very helpful in not scaring people because of your wanting to solve the problem today.
Yes, yeah. This is that's some great advice, and this has been some really great advice. I say it almost every time that I have a guest on the show, but we could talk about this all afternoon because it's something that obviously you're passionate about, and you have a lot of experience, and just the research that you've done is pretty significant. So if veterans or listeners, other providers who are listening to the show, if they want to hear more about you or some of the research that you've done or your organization, how could they find that on the internet?
Well, we have a website. It's if you just Google the Center for Innovation and Research, it'll come up, or you can email me directly at carl.castro@usc.edu, and I'll send you material that you have in mind.
Yeah, so I'll make sure that both of those links are in the show notes, and those can be found both on veteranmentalhealth.com and changeyourpov.com. Well, I appreciate you taking the time, Carl. I think that this probably will not be the last time that we talk.
Well, it's a pleasure, and I'd love to come back and talk about 1,000 other topics of interest to veterans and their families.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Bye.
You're listening to Headspace and Timing on the Change Your POV Podcast Network. This was some really good insight into the research and how it can help veterans and those who support them. There's a lot of really great research and the results from studies that can really help veterans get to a place of or sustain wellness after the military. That's one of the things I hope we can do here, which is bring the results of that research and get it into the hands of the ones who could really use it, veterans, their families, and their community. Carl talked about transition stress, the challenges that veterans face upon leaving the military. Everyone changes from the individual they were when they were 19 or 20 years old to the person they are now when they're 30 or 40. But the military accelerates those changes, multiple deployments and combat even more so. We also talked about the need for meaning and purpose. If there's any theme that emerges from this show, beyond just the need to change the way we think and talk about veteran mental health, it's the fact that one of the most significant difficulties that veterans face after the military is finding meaning and purpose in their post-military life. If you have that, other stuff can seem manageable. If you don't have that, the other stuff can be overwhelming. I recommend that you take a look at all of the paradoxes Dr. Castro and his colleagues identified. We talked about 4 in the show: the safety paradox, the silence paradox, the courage paradox, and the intimacy paradox. There are 12 overall that they identified. Go to veteranmentalhealth.com/paradox to check them out. They'll also be linked in the show notes, which can be found at veteranmentalhealth.com and changeyourpov.com. If you've been listening to the recent shows, you know I've been talking a lot about the release of my latest book, Combat Vet Don't Mean Crazy. I've heard a lot of great feedback on it. Whether you're a veteran, a family member of a veteran, or someone that works with veterans in any capacity, it's a great way to understand the military mindset and find strength and stability in post-military life. Finally, thanks to this week's sponsors, USA Military Medals. If you're proud of your service, like I am, it's a great place to go to get that stuff out of the back of your closet and displayed in a manner that your service deserves. You can find out more about them and all the things that help us do what we do at changeyourpov.com/resources. Make sure you tune in next week when we talk about a great organization that's here in my backyard, Project Sanctuary. I have a talk with the founder and executive director, Heather Ely, about therapeutic retreats that are created and delivered with mental health and wellness in mind. Here's a quick preview.
Our whole philosophy is that we believe everyone has the ability to heal, and everyone has within themselves the knowledge, what they need to do to heal and move themselves forward. So it's just empowering the family, giving them that space and time to remember who they are and what they want, and letting them know that they have a huge friend with Project Sanctuary, an advocate who will walk alongside them and help open a few doors.
Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. Until then, stay focused and be well. I'd like to thank the Change Your POV Podcast Network for hosting this show and highlighting the critical importance of veteran mental health. We want to hear from you. You can reach out to me via email at dwayne@veteranmentalhealth.com. You can find me at Twitter at @TheCounselingVet, or head on over to Facebook and look for the Change Your POV Squad. You can find the show notes for this episode and all the episodes by going to veteranmentalhealth.com or changeyourpov.com. Sign up for updates on either or both so you don't miss another episode. While you're at it, check out the other great shows on the Change Your POV Podcast Network. The show about remembering our military history and reviving our warrior spirit, changing hearts and minds. The show about outdoor activities that us veterans love so much, Neophyte in the Woods. The show that helps us get going at the beginning of the week, Motivation Monday. And Attack Fridays, the show that brings you actionable tips, tricks, and coachable knowledge to help you make the best of your transition. While you're checking out the other shows, drop us a review in iTunes or whatever podcast platform you're listening to. The reviews really help spread the word about what we're doing. If you're looking for the total package for all the information you need to live the life you want after leaving the military, you found it. If you know of a buddy who's looking for the same info, share it with them so they can find it too. I want to thank Doc Todd for his permission to use his track, Not Alone, from his amazing album, Combat Medicine. Doc Todd is somebody who's trying to bring veteran mental health out of the darkness and into the light, and you can get the album by going to therealdoctodd.com. Check it out, because remember, veterans, you're not alone. Ever.
The struggle is real, found a feast and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone weeds, overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over enemies, co-created mini-me's. Broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P., I'd rather grind in tranquility. embrace my ability.
Oh, I try so hard to have faith.
Amen.
I bow my head and I pray.
Keep praying.
Lord, please let me the strength to carry on and keep staying.
Stand up.
How this life so demanding, so much pain on this planet. I hurt each time I wake,
Tell 'em, man.
but with you I'm not alone.
Not alone. You're not alone.
Ah, yeah. And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, get myself back up again.
Without my Georgia girls, yeah, I'd probably be dead. Cause I'd be taking every med that the VA said. Gave every shred, every last thread of my identity. Conquer my fragility, eliminate the enemy. Deliver me, God, from temptation. Tell me that this life is just a matrix. Need a facelift, back to basics. Vision LASIX, I only feel alive when I hear the bass kick.
Oh, I try so hard to have faith.
Amen.
I bow my head and I pray.
Keep praying.
Lord, please let me the strength to carry on and keep staying.
Stand up.
How this life so demanding, so much pain on this planet. I hurt each time I wake, but with you I'm not alone.
Not alone. Yeah. You're not alone.
Ah, yeah. And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, pick myself back up again.
Yeah, just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone, man. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Yeah, pick up the phone, I'm right here. And I love you guys. Take those bottles out, dog, and pour them in the sink. Take the needles out your arm and the gun away from your forehead. It's time, man, you've been through enough pain, stand up. It's time to stand back up. All my veterans, man, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. Get up, you know.